The Honourable Robin Chapple.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I acknowledge that I stand here today on Noongar land to deliver what is either a continuing inaugural speech or a second one, I'm not sure, to this chamber. Mr. President, I wish to express my congratulations to you on your election to the position of President of this chamber, and I look forward to serving in this place with you as President. As with all who have gone before you, I am sure that you will deliberate with great bearing and fairness. Firstly, I would like to offer thanks to the two groups of Assembly candidates who have helped the Greens regain a seat in the mining and pastoral region. These thanks stretch back to 2005, when 5 dear Lower House candidates assisted in that attempt to retain the seat. They were Kelly Howlett in central Kimberley Pilbara, the inimitable Pat Lowe in Kimberley, Peter Berger in Kalgoorlie, Peter Shaw in Northwest Coastal, and in Murchison Eyre, Scott Ludlam, my dear friend who has now gone on to take his rightful place in federal politics as the West Australians Greens' second senator. In this last election, which now seems a lifetime away, we must go to fixed term elections. Our thanks go to Peter Shaw in the Northwest. Peter Shaw is a long-time resident and tourist operator in Coral Bay who has devoted a significant amount of his time working to achieve sustainable management for the region. Annabelle Sands in the seat of Kimberley, a well-renowned Kimberley artist, photographer and passionate protector of the humpback well nurseries along the Kimberley coast, who was ably assisted by her partner, driver and campaign manager, filmmaker Richard Costin during that election. The tireless Kelly Howlett in the seat of Pilbara, a councillor in the town of Port Hedland, whose drive in developing a turtle monitoring program, tourism and establishing the Care for Hedland group has established her well within that community. In the seat of Kalgoorlie, my thanks go to Andy Huntley, a superintendent for a local nickel mine who brought a passion for sustainability and renewable energy to the campaign. I would also like at this time to convey my congratulations to Andy and his partner Akaranda on the birth of their baby boy Flynn. And in the seat of Ayr, our candidate was one of the youngest, Linda Parker, the 2008 Kalgoorlie Boulder Chamber of Commerce Goldfields Apprentice of the Year, currently completing an apprenticeship in the electrical trades in the goldfields, doing what she believes in by designing and installing renewable energy systems throughout the goldfields, wheat belt and south coast. Whilst there are many hundreds of people who devoted their time in supporting the 2008 Green campaign in the mining and pastoral area, all who deserve thanks, I must again single out my daughter Sarah for her undying support. Along with her 2 sons, Taylor and Kai, and a partner, Dave, the inimitable sandwich maker, their support for the Kalgoorlie campaign was incredible and untiring. In 2005, when I failed to retain the mining and pastoral seat, we placed at the sign at the front door of 107 Port Hay Street, my former office, saying, "Out to lunch," back in 2009. It was a pretty long lunch, but as Michael Jordan said when he announced his return to the Chicago Bulls, "I'm back." This time with a new office team supporting our green effort. I welcome Tim Hall, Helen Beach, Anne-Marie Heindinger to the next 4 years of toil. I would also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge my colleagues, old and new in this chamber. The Honourable Giz Watson, our parliamentary bedrock and monitor. The Hon Lynn McLaren, a former fleeting member in this place in 2005. And the Hon Alison Zamon, who joins us as the first Greens member to represent the East Metropolitan region. We will also be joined shortly in the other place by our new elected member for Fremantle, the epoch-making Adele Cowles. I intend to talk primarily of the future. However, I would first ask members to reflect on what is a heinous day for democracy, and that occurred in China on this day 20 years ago. The tanks and troops moved into Tiananmen Square and brutally ended 7 weeks occupancy by the democracy movement, causing an estimated 2,600 deaths. This is the same government, the perpetrator of so many human rights abuses, that Australia is now considering allowing to become an 18% shareholder in Rio Tinto through its wholly owned company, Chinalco. On this anniversary of Tiananmen atrocity, I would ask members to reflect on the ethical line between economic expedience and our responsibility as parliamentarians to uphold and promote human rights at home and globally. As I've already said, I've had the privilege of giving a principal inaugural speech, and I will endeavour, though I think I'm starting to build on that endeavour, to keep this introduction here succinct. Little has changed since May 29, 2001, when I first addressed this House. The guard has changed, but the rhetoric remains basically the same. No one seems prepared to tackle the future crisis confronting this state. The same sad circumstances are evident across the nation. Any ostrich incapable of burying its head in the sand would find the parliaments of Australia a great training ground. There is an irrational disconnect between what we will do in this place over the next 4 years and the realities of the conflict over climate change that is taking place around the world and on our doorstep outside these hallowed walls. Mr. President, whether or not I reintroduce voluntary euthanasia bill, debate the values of a feed-in tariff regime, debate truth in sentencing legislation, or discuss budgetary constraint, these will all fade into relative insignificance if this House fails to confront responsibly the global crisis that is on our doorstep. The world and the community at large have now accepted that we're subject to the effects of climate change. The scientific community, the experts, our experts, have now confirmed that we are dealing with dangerous climate change. And yet over the next 4 years there appears to be no legislative program to deal with the elephants firmly grazing in the middle of either this or the other chamber. At the Chamber of Minerals and Energy AGM lunch on the 22nd of May 2009, which I attended, the Premier stated that he had disagreed with Bill Clinton's statements, "It's the economy, stupid," when he outlined his view, "It's mining and petroleum, stupid." I have a different view. I say it's the future, stupid. Our global commitment on climate change so far has been akin to setting out to individually polish each one of the Titanic's deck chairs prior to attempting to rearrange them on the deck in response to our collision with an iceberg. If we carry that analogy to include Western Australia, then it's fair to say that our policymakers have just decided to go below to order dessert in the Grand Ballroom. I would remind members that the world's 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, when he said, "You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today." Our response to date has been to tinker with inadequate and short-sighted policy. It has been woeful, inadequate and blinkered. Much of our direction is still predicated on greed is good, as espoused in the semi-fictitious 1987 film Wall Street. Endless global economic growth pursued regardless of the environmental and human limits of a finite planet. Signs of ecological collapse are emerging around the world. Values equating to welfare with possession and the conspicuous consumption prevail amid unhappiness and stark social and economic poverty. Mr. President, the belief that the marketplace is dominant implies that the environment is a subsystem of the economy and that social values exist to serve that market. The reverse is the case. The economy and society are very firmly subsystems of a global environment. Population and economic growth has exceeded the carrying capacity of this earth. The prevailing conservative value system is therefore fundamentally flawed. We see this in the uncontrolled expansion and support for the hydrocarbon industry and the desire to mine one of the world's most toxic elements, uranium, with little concern for the tens of thousands of years of contamination and health hazards that future generations will have to deal with. Currently, we in Western Australia are spiralling towards doubling our CO2 emissions from those established for our state in 1990, in the year of the establishment of the Kyoto Protocol. It has been established that in 1990, Western Australia's gross CO2e emissions were 58.2 million tonnes per annum. By 2007, these had reached 82.8 million tonnes per annum, an increase of 42.3%. Since 2007, with the advent of Woodside Train 5, the Blue Waters Power Station, and other developments such as the recommissioning of the Muja power stations, WA emissions would now be in the region of 85 to 90 million tonnes per annum. If we tabulate the projected emissions from the two new Woodside Pluto trains, the Woodside Browse Basin project, the Dyno Nobel explosives plant, the current Gorgon 2 train proposal, the Yarra Holdings explosives plant, Apache Reindeer proposal, the BHP Scarborough gas development, emissions will rise to at least a further 21.5 million tonnes per annum, lifting WA emissions to around 110.5 million tonnes per annum. This would increase WA's greenhouse gas emissions to 90% of our 1990 emissions. And this does not include any of the proposed expansions articulated by Don Volte, CEO of Woodside, in yesterday's Business News. It is disconcerting to note that whilst the nation has committed to a maximum increase of emissions of 8% above our 1990 levels, this does not apply to Western Australia. We are truly living in isolation from the rest of the world, not just because of our geography, but in our avoidance of global realities. Mr. President, on Wednesday 25th of March 2009 at the State Library Theatre in Northbridge, Dr. Graham Pearman, the national and international expert in research on increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere, and the former chief of CSIRO atmospheric research from 1992 to 2002, spoke on the problems created by climate change. When asked about the doubling of WA's CO2 emissions associated with the burgeoning gas industry, Dr. Pearman replied, "There should be no gas industry unless it has zero emissions." I now turn to another issue of greed is good: uranium mining. This is an industry with no moral responsibility, no compassion, and no concept of intergenerational equity. As a former member of the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, the National Radiation Health Committee, for the last 3 years, I can speak with a degree or an element of authority on this matter. I have recently read with interest many of the comments made in respect to the uranium debate and its hazards or lack thereof. This debate is being skewed by the lack of understanding of the known radiation impacts or the relevant standards and regulations regarding radioactivity. The materials mined, uranium, pitchblende, and produced yellowcake are all highly radioactive. These materials emit in varying degrees alpha and beta ionising radiation, with the attendant production of radioactive radon gas. There are two types of ionising radiation. One consists of particulates, alpha, beta, and neutrons, and the other consists of electromagnetic, X-rays and gamma rays. It is recognised by all authorities that all of the above elements are harmful to life. When we are exposed to these elements, they either affect our genetic markers or through ingestion or inhalation and lodgement create internal lesions that produce over time a cohort of cancers above the normal statistical background. Mr. President, the hazards of ionising radiation elements, as far as we, our children and their descendants to the 9th degree are concerned, do not diminish over time. The industry has stated that we should not worry about the longevity of radioactive impact as the 200,000 years required for uranium and its waste to decay is not a very long time in the life of a rock. Any waste material or host rock is almost as radioactive as the uranium being mined and has the same lifetime radioactive impacts as the uranium ore. Researchers confirmed that there is no safe threshold dose for radiation below which no damage is done. One radioactive decay trail through one cell can cause cancer. The average annual background dose of radiation to people in Australia is an absorbed dose of around about 1.5 to 2 millisieverts per year. The International Committee on Radiation Protection, the IRCP, recommends that an allowance of 1 millisievert, 100 millirems, annual maximum exposure dose above background radiation for the general public. Their own studies indicate that this statistically generates a risk of 3.5 cancers in 1,000 people exposed annually over a lifetime of 70 years. Mr. President, the uranium industry cannot operate within the ICPR guidelines due to the point source of radiation at a mine site being some 70 to 90 times higher than natural background radiation. As a simple numerical way of explaining this, the background radiation in this chamber would be in the region of 35 to 40 counts on a Geiger-Müller tube. Quite often we are told by the uranium industry that the Darling Scarp is as radioactive as a uranium mine. It is true that the scarp produces slightly elevated levels of radiation, but the levels are well within the recommended safe doses. Not so uranium deposits, outcrops and mines, which produce, as I've already said, radiation levels which are some 70 to 90 times higher. The uranium mining industry has consistently protested the ICRP guidelines because it would be impossible for people to work at a uranium mine if normal radiation health requirements were to apply. Mr. President, as I've already said, the background radiation in this chamber is 35 to 40 Geiger-Müller tube counts. The Perth Hills at a granite outcrops would emit a safe count rate of between 60 to 80 counts. This piece of uranium lens ore from a proposed uranium mine produces beta and alpha count rate of around about 2,900 counts. And whilst it is not harmful to us because it is protected, if we were exposed to it for any length of time, it would be hazardous. So to facilitate the existence of uranium mines, special regulations for the exceedance of the mining industry had to be established to allow workers to be exposed to 50 millisieverts a year or so above the general background level. This is 50 times the general public safe dose level. It must be noted that when we established those guidelines, we did make one provision, that at least pregnant workers were not permitted to be exposed to these levels. These guidelines are contained within the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency's recommendations for limiting exposure to ionising radiation. It's the 2002 dose rate limit. Mr. President, we have to remember that with uranium there is always the issue of who takes the waste. To this end, I received an email on Monday the 25th of the 5th, 2009 from Dr. Charles McCombie, the former CEO of Pangaea, the British nuclear fuels waste dump company. This was the company that was seeking to bury 20% of the world's nuclear waste near Cosmo Newbury in the northern goldfields. He was seeking my take on the status of the nuclear debate in Australia. And I will quote from that email. Your email reminded me that it's a long time since we talked or exchanged information. We are struggling along with Arius, the Swiss think tank mutated from the Pangaea Corporation, that's my words, with our aim of making safe and secure disposal of radioactive waste available to all countries that need it. Our main focus is on the viability of multinational options, either by partnering small countries or by hosting of a large country. As ever, this is a hot topic, but with the continuing rise in interest in nuclear power, it becomes ever more important. If even a fraction of the long list of small countries professing an interest in nuclear leads to actual power stations, then the global community should be concerned that the back end, a waste dump, is taken seriously. So do not be fooled. Uranium mining is merely a conduit to the contamination of our hinterland for all time. Mr. President, it may appear that the Greens rail against the entire mining industry. This is not the case. What we are for is developments that are occupationally safe and which aspire to carbon-free standards. The removal of carbon-based fuel systems is paramount. Although some facilities within the mining industry are presently dependent on fossil fuels for mining and extraction and the processing of ore, it is now the considered belief by many engineers, the examples are emerging, that all of these processes can be converted to non-fossil fuel dependency. Most of today's underground mines operate on electricity, with the exception of ore handling and hauling. Drilling and pumping operations are electric. Ore hauling and handling can be converted to run from electric power sources by designing mines appropriately with the use of vertical electric winders or monorail systems to bring ore to the surface instead of the long declines with mining trucks. Mr. President, the South African system of electric monorail mine haulage and those being promoted by the Kalgoorlie Chamber of Mines are a case in point. These not only run solely on electricity, reducing diesel consumption dramatically, but produce greater efficiencies, deeper mines, with bottom-up stope design, which diminishes the need for waste dumps, and better occupational health and safety issues associated with reduced rockfall and less exposure of underground workers to the inhalation of diesel particulates. Many open pit operations use diesel-powered shovels and drills. These functions can be performed, and in many cases are, using high voltage electrical earth moving equipment. Haul packs use phenomenal amounts of diesel at most open pit mines, But again, with the correct motivation and incentive, conveyor and lift systems can be devised and implemented to perform this function using electricity. Mr. President, ore processing and refining uses mostly electrical energy, with the exception of plants requiring steam and heat. Both steam and heat can be provided as a direct byproduct of solar thermal power plants, or as indirect byproducts of any kind of renewable electricity generating plant, using electric heating elements and electric steam boilers. In the short term, mining and processing of metals using fossil fuels emits CO2, but structural change in our industry must occur. The construction of large-scale grid-connected renewable energy plants following America's lead, and the redesign of existing and new mining operations around sustainable principles is essential. The same could be said, I believe, for most other industries on this planet. At the end of the day, if the will to change is there, the mining industry, like most others, could become a zero-emissions industry. I believe we have to think big in this regard. Tinkering around the edges of our existing system cannot deliver the large-scale changes we need in order to become a truly sustainable society. This approach, thinking big and aspiring to true sustainability, compassion and equity in society, applies to all the issues which I intend to address during this term of Parliament. I intend to continue my support for the introduction of voluntary euthanasia legislation in Western Australia. I will continue to champion the cause of the Kimberley agricultural herbicide workers who have suffered contamination from working with these herbicides. I will continue to campaign for the long overdue World Heritage listing of the Indigenous rock art on the Burrup or Murujuga Peninsula. Mr. President, I will continue to work with my fellow Green parliamentarians and with all members here to build an environment of responsibility, of transparency, and of the rigorous debate in this House as we discharge our collective duty to the people of Western Australia. I would like to end by restating my final words from my principal inaugural in 2001. I look forward to my term in this chamber, proudly representing the future of the mining and pastoral region, Western Australia, and our planet. I commit my time in this chamber to representing the needs of the community, the environment, a healthy and sustainable future for all future generations, and to my daughter, Sarah, and my grandchildren, Taylor and Kai. It is for their future and the other children of their generation that I take my place in this chamber. Thank you.